Welcome to our A-Level History students. This video today is going to be about Unit 3, which is Civil Rights in the USA 1865 to 1992. And as you can see, we're going to focus on African Americans and the Black Power movement of the 1960s. What we're going to do is look at four main things. We're going to look at the position of African Americans in the 1960s at the start of the decade. We're going to think about the actions of the US government. We're then going to think about the actions of individuals, and we're going to think about important organisations that exist at this time. In terms of your exam, you're going to be able to use this information for both types of question. So you're going to be able to use it for the thematic question, which looks at civil rights across the whole 130-year period. But you're also going to be able to use it for the evaluation question, as this is one of your particular time periods that can be asked about. Let's start by looking at the position of African Americans in the 1960s. By 1960, African Americans were still experiencing restrictions when trying to vote in many parts of the South of the United States of America. There was still segregation present in many states. There was therefore still prejudice and outbreaks of violence. And we saw that Southern politicians and state legislators were often preventing change in regards to African American rights. Therefore, by 1960, there are considerable gaps between black and white people in terms of income, in terms of housing, and in terms of opportunity. Facilities for African Americans were inferior, and in many areas there were distinct areas that were either black or white. Therefore, for some historians, the situation for African Americans was in some ways worse in 1960 than it was back in 1869. So our key point is this: by the 1960s, most elements of the post-1877 situation still remain. If that's the position of African Americans in the 1960s, then the next thing we'd like to do is think about the actions of the US government to try and tackle this. However, first we need to ask the question, well, what's changed by 1960? Why is there an appetite for change, and why do things change eventually? Well, firstly, better communication, particularly television, means that racial violence has been brought home to many Americans nationally. They see it, they witness it, they see the hatred, the extent of the violence, and that brings many Americans along in agreement that things need to be done to improve African American civil rights. Also during the 1960s, the propaganda of the USSR has increasingly criticised America for continuing violence and discrimination. In terms of your general knowledge, you'll be aware that during the 1960s, we're really at the height of the Cold War period. And so this propaganda and this accusation by America's key international enemy is really quite significant. The third reason is that in 1955, the murder of Emmett Till made international headlines. Even more so because his killers were acquitted by an all-white jury after deliberating for only 1 hour. Emmett Till was a young African American boy who was accused of being fresh, being rude or disrespectful to a white woman. You can see here a picture of him before and then after his brutal murder. This is another agent for change in the fight for African American civil rights. Fourthly, there's also pictures of the abuse at Little Rock School in Arkansas, and these were very dangerous for the image of the USA because these images became again international. So again, this links perhaps to point number one about better communication. Again, the abuse and the hatred from seemingly middle-class white Americans towards African Americans simply trying to attend school resonates and reflects very badly on America as a free society, which it clearly wasn't. Lastly, by 1960, African Americans are also better organised and they're more skillful in making demands about their civil rights. So what does the US government do in the 1960s to try and change that? Well, in the early 1960s, we have the election of John F. Kennedy. However, we should say this, change is slow to emerge in his presidency. Firstly, we should say this, JFK made many sympathetic speeches to the plight of African Americans and to their need for greater protection and greater civil rights. He appoints many African Americans to positions of authority. And finally, by 1963, a civil rights bill is presented to Congress. However, you should be aware that the influence of the Southern white bloc in Congress often slows progress for these civil rights to be achieved. In addition to that, there's quite a prominent murder of the civil rights leader Medgar Evers in 1962. But there's also the March on Washington in 1963, where 250,000 people listened to Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And all of these things are operating at the same time. So progress is attempted to be made, but is very slow. As we know, JFK is then assassinated in the early 1960s. And so really, we're focusing now on his successor. That's Lyndon B. Johnson. And in comparison to Kennedy, where change is very slow to emerge, change is far more rapid under his presidency. Why is that? Well, firstly, as the president, Kennedy, was assassinated in 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson has a platform to now argue, well, JFK wanted this. He wanted civil rights to be broader and more inclusive, particularly for African Americans, and he therefore can say, well, I need to fulfill that man's vision after sacrificing his life for his country. We should also say this, Lyndon B. Johnson was a Southern Democrat, and so he'd experienced poverty in the South for himself, and therefore he had a vision for a great society, one that was far more equal. We see, therefore, several pieces of legislation and constitutional amendments to help facilitate the improvement of African American rights. Take a moment to just read about these four key actions. We've now had a brief summary of what the US government does to try and improve African American civil rights. But perhaps more significantly at this time, it's the actions of key individuals or key movements, particularly within the black community, that facilitates change. However, before we start, we should just say this, these 20th century resistance movements do have precedent. And then before we even start to look at them, we should perhaps clarify our key terminology. We're going to be thinking about black power, and that's the notion that African Americans have to gain power for themselves because it will not be given to them. We're going to refer to the Black Panthers, a nationalist and socialist African American group formed in the late 1960s, and we're going to be looking at the Nation of Islam as well, which was formed much earlier in 1930. We'll also be looking at the role of Martin Luther King. And it's Martin Luther King that I'd like to start with. You can see him pictured here on our slide. Martin Luther King came from a religious background, and therefore he incorporates some of that experience that he has in church into his civil rights campaigning. Principally that means inspirational oratory for which he's famous, and the importance of organisation being brought to the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King as well seeks the support of white Americans in the search for African American civil rights. And there's going to be a reaction to that, particularly from someone like Malcolm X, but eventually in the late 1960s from other African American organisations. Remember though, these things have precedence, and this is much in line with what Booker T. Washington did in the late 1800s and the early 20th century. Martin Luther King was inspired by non-violence and the ideas of mass demonstration to bring around change. But principally he's interested in integration and equality with white America, not separatism. He wants black Americans to be integrated and equal with their white citizens. What does he do therefore? Well, he supports the bus boycotts that exist in the 1950s, famously with Rosa Parks in 1955. And he forms the Southern Church Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. He's famously part of the March on Washington that we've mentioned already once. And he is, over time, arrested multiple times, 29 times in total, through his various participation in marches and demonstrations. Perhaps we should give you some concrete examples. Martin Luther King is one of the key organisers of the Birmingham, Alabama March. This is significant because this is televised. Because the police chief, Eugene Bull, to his friends O'Connor, takes the bait of acting brutally towards these peaceful protesters. The use of dogs, the use of water cannon on African Americans who are peacefully protesting makes a significant impact on the attitudes of other Americans towards African American rights. We also see, as we said, the March on Washington. This involves several organisations, including the SCLC, the NAACP, and the SNCC. Martin Luther King famously delivers his I Have a Dream speech here to approximately 250,000 people supporting civil rights change. This is a key moment in the history of African American civil rights. Eventually we see that then dovetail with the 1964 Civil Rights Act that you read about when we were talking about Lyndon B. Johnson. Marches continue though in 1964, particularly in Selma, Alabama. Again, 25,000 people attempt to march from there to Montgomery, and this is over the issue of being allowed to vote, because some voting restrictions have still been put in place. But it's at this point that there is some impatience with non-violence growing amongst the African American community. This civil rights march is cancelled a couple of times by Martin Luther King in the face of police presence. And for some African Americans, that is therefore conforming to what white Americans want, rather than fighting for African American rights. Lastly, we also have the 1965 Civil Rights Act, and this is to do with making the 15th Amendment passed into law. The 15th Amendment, as you know, allowed for people to vote despite their background as maybe a slave. It also banned any kind of voter discrimination based on other factors. However, as we know, many states circumvented that with other methods of denying people the right to vote, such as grandfather clauses, for example. The Civil Rights Act for voting seeks therefore to overcome that. What's an assessment of Martin Luther King going to look like then? Well, we can perhaps say this. In terms of his impact, the scale of his activities does lead to civil rights legislation. So therefore his work resulted in significant changes in the law. And that is very different to some other civil rights leaders that we're about to see. Essentially, therefore, Martin Luther King not only had a large following, but he also had results. There was tangible change. There was permanent change in terms of laws and constitutional amendments. However, he was criticised for working closely with white Americans, just like Booker T. Washington. There were accusations of him being inconsistent and even hesitant, particularly in Selma. And it's also clear to say that constitutional and legal rights did not necessarily mean there were social and economic improvements. Just because African Americans were now protected by law and the Constitution did not mean that their daily experience changed radically. And we should also say this, Martin Luther King obviously benefited from the hard work of local activists who often laid the groundwork. A second individual that you need to be aware of is Malcolm X. He also has a religious background, but he converts to Islam in adulthood. He suffered racial persecution as a youngster. More than likely, his father, who was found dead in 1931, was murdered because of his race, and his mother has a mental breakdown because of this. Malcolm X becomes a professional criminal, and eventually, after a time in prison, joins the Nation of Islam. He believes in separatism as opposed to integration and equality, believing that African Americans can never achieve those things on a par with white Americans, and that therefore they should create their own separate state. Therefore, he believes in this. Malcolm X is incredibly skilled at writing and speaking, increasing the Nation of Islam to a membership of 40,000 by 1960. He preached, therefore, violent revolution, going along that separatist line. And this linked ideas of socialism, pan-nationalism, i.e. uniting all black peoples around the world, anti-colonization and radical Islam. However, in 1964, he breaks from the Nation of Islam as he's disappointed with the immoral behaviour of some of its leadership. So, how should we view Malcolm X's work? Well, very briefly, we can say this: he has a significant influence on the Black Power movement through his writings and his preaching. His influence on African Americans having a sense of pride and identity as well, rather than being dependent on white values, is significant. However, he does not have the sort of success King has, although he does fight for separatism, so he is fighting for something slightly different. Again, much like we said at the start, there's a precedent here as well, because Marcus Garvey in the early 20th century had far more support than Malcolm X and advocated something similar in terms of a separate black nation. Finally, let's look at some of the key organisations in the African American civil rights movement. The first one is the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, the NAACP. This included people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida Wells, and liberal whites, and was founded in 1909. However, it was for African Americans rather than being led by African Americans. But its most famous work comes in the 1950s, through its involvement in the Brown versus Board of Education case, its involvement in the bus boycotts, and its involvement in the Little Rock schools integration. However, after its participation in the March on Washington, its influence does ebb. Two other organisations that you should be aware of are CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which was founded in 1942, although again 2/3 of its initial members were white. The third point I've put here is not an organisation, but it's a collection of organisations who believed in mass demonstration. The Council of Federal Organisations was created in 1962, and that included the NAACP, the SCLC, founded by Martin Luther King, CORE, who we just mentioned, and also the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council, the SNCC. All of these organisations working together believed in non-violent expressions of discontent. They all looked for white support in the fight for African American civil rights, and they sought to exert the right to freedom of expression to bring the issues to the attention of the wider American public. Therefore, it's not an organisation, but it's a tactic used by several organisations at this time. Another organisation you need to be aware of is the Nation of Islam. This was inspired by the separatist black nationalist movements led by Marcus Garvey in the early 20th century. The Nation of Islam itself was founded by Wallace Muhammad and dominated by Elijah Muhammad until 1975. The Nation of Islam relied on a vibrant newspaper and clear ideas on black superiority. What was its impact? Well, its links with Islam increased the belief that African Americans were the chosen people of Allah, something that they certainly propagated. It gave the movement a religious strength, a bit like this SCLC, although not to the same extent. It had a strong ideology, which had no alignment with white America whatsoever, or any support from it either. And therefore, for the Nation of Islam, matters of things like voter registration or equal political rights were not something that needed to be pursued. If we believe as Nation of Islam members that there is black superiority and there should be a separate black nation, then why would we seek, or why would they seek, to try and vote in a white dominated system or gain political rights in a white dominated system? Therefore, the efforts of Martin Luther King provoked much hatred from the Nation of Islam because of his cooperation with white America. And then lastly, the Civil Rights Act, although seemingly positive, was simply not enough, because African American superiority, not equality, needed to be acknowledged. So what was the Nation of Islam's influence on black power? Well, as said, they were very critical of Martin Luther King's approach. In fact, many accused him of being an Uncle Tom, a derogatory term that meant he was deferential and somehow dependent on white people. In 1962, James Meredith entered the University of Mississippi, and he was the first African American to do so. He was then shot on a civil rights march in 1966, and this added to the increasing tensions that were starting to emerge since 1964 within the civil rights movement. One example of how that tension manifests itself is that the previously non-violent SNCC and CORE changed their course, particularly around the frustrations after the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the disorganisation and indecision of Martin Luther King at Selma in Alabama. In fact, Stokely Carmichael, an SNCC member, changed tack when he started saying, well, what we need is black power. And what he means there, as opposed to black equality. Therefore, the Nation of Islam influences the civil rights movement because it influences some groups to move from cooperation instead to isolation and confrontation. So the SNCC and CORE begin to exclude whites, celebrate African heritage, and pursue more radical demands. A final organisation that you should be aware of are the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Weapons were carried, defence groups against police brutality were formed, and their aims included economic equality, compensation for African Americans in the form of land and housing, an end to capitalist exploitation, separate juries for black people, and as you can see, therefore, was far more radical and comes under that umbrella of the Black Power movement. In essence, they saw a conflict between a white state and a separate black culture, and there was a belief that the two could not therefore mix. Separatist rather than integration. That brings us to the end of this video. It doesn't cover everything that you need to know. It gives you pointers to some of the main events that you should read around and revise for yourself. But to help in terms of your revision, why don't you try these 10 questions to check your understanding of what you just learnt?